Hello and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, the podcast where we take you back to the good old days. Just maybe not quite how you might expect, given the zeitgeist. I am Megan Cox.
And I am Clayton Becker.
And welcome back for the second part in our first two-part series. Clayton, what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about rejecting process and embracing results.
Okay, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by that?
Let's take just a step back and say that, yes, as Megan said, this is the second episode in our little two-part special here. If you haven't already listened to the first part last week, Reject Small Government, Embrace Government Capacity, please go listen to that one first. The stuff we're about to talk about in this one will make a lot more sense in that context.
Or be a rebel, do you, whatever you need to do today.
Sure. But so rejecting process and embracing results basically is once we have built the government capacity that we talked about in the last episode, once we've actually done the things that we said were necessary, like proper staffing levels, proper funding, making sure that government employees actually have salaries commensurate with their experience and expertise to attract qualified, dedicated people to the role, so on and so forth. Once we have that, the government actually needs to then go ahead and do things, right? It can't afford to get bogged down in legalese and process and lawyer the hell out of everything that we try to do. And right now, unfortunately, in my opinion at least.
Yeah, that sounds awfully familiar, Clayton.
As the attorney on the podcast, Megan might have something to say about this, but the Democratic Party in particular right now is just absolutely addicted to process. And we want to say up at the top here that what we're proposing here is not just do what Trump is doing, move fast and break things, but left wing. We're not saying to do that, right? There is a degree of process that perhaps we should adhere to here. What Trump is doing.
And if we have established a process, we should probably follow it.
Yes.
If you don't like the process, you change the process, but don't just do whatever.
Yes, exactly. So this is about changing processes. We'll get into this in sort of the second half of the podcast. What Trump is doing is illegal, breaking things, perhaps irretrievably in lots of circumstances, and it's not well thought out. It will absolutely not work. And so we're not proposing to do that. What we are going to do, and we want to argue here, is that once we have that state capacity, we have to do things. And right now, while we are rapidly dismantling our capacity to do things, we're also putting in these layer upon layer of processes and making it incredibly hard to find the political will to actually do anything with the government, because you're just going to be bogged down in 2 years of process if you start any big initiative. This is, I think, obviously true at the national level. The filibuster, stops everything, where it stifles any sort of real attempt to solve big problems with substantial legislation. We can't get universal healthcare, can't get immigration reform, can't get free tuition at public colleges and universities. Bureaucratic procedures and lawsuits slowing down the machinery of government. Just to give you an example, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was passed during Biden's administration, intended to increase infrastructure spending, solve this big backlog of infrastructure projects. That being slowed down, coupled with inflation, meant that infrastructure spending per year was actually lower during the Biden administration after we passed this big $800 billion law in inflation-adjusted terms than it was during the 2010s before the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is just one example of how this happens at the national level. But what Megan and
additionally, I will say not to make this too much about politics rather than about governance, but the idea or the feeling or the vibe that government isn't achieving very much is in many ways somewhat dictated by this process. Even on the back end, once Congress passes things like the infrastructure bill, if you never see any of that change happening, it's very easy to assume that government isn't doing very much. And that, again, decreases trust and confidence in government. And then why do we want to give government more money to do anything?
Yeah, precisely. And it's even true just if it takes a long time to get implemented. Not only just if it sort of never gets implemented, if it just takes a year and a half, if it takes 2 years, right, between passage of the bill and implementation, people often will not connect the two together. right? And they can hardly be blamed for doing so, right? Like they can hardly be blamed for not connecting law passed 2 years ago to the fact that the bridge in my town is getting like construction work done on it, right? Like it's not something we can really blame people for.
Yes.
But aside from this like state capacity malaise that lingers over the federal government nowadays, where this addiction to process is like particularly insane is at the state and local level. Like polarization stops action in Washington and like certain bureaucratic procedures stop action in Washington. But an addiction to process hampers it in states and in cities in just a completely different way, to the extent where we like basically cannot build things anymore. Like we basically cannot build big projects. What I'm going to do now is, Megan, I'm gonna hit you with like a list of examples here, basically. I don't know if you will have heard of any of these. I don't know if our listeners will have heard of these, but these are some of the ones that over the past, I think like 5 years, basically, maybe like 5-10 years, have like caught my attention as like, wow, this is insane. Why are we doing this? So first and foremost, one of the most insane things I've ever heard of come out of the country is San Bernardino County, just east of where I live in Los Angeles, effectively banned all new wind power and all new utility scale solar in the entire county, just by zoning basically the entire county as being for single family homes. Like they just took the unincorporated land and they were like, that's for single family homes. You can't build wind projects there now. Because in order to get a variance around the single family zoning, you have to go through all of this discretionary permitting. And
I see. Okay, I was going to say, how is this about process?
And the county officials will not approve discretionary permits, even though most of San Bernardino County is literally just desert, right? Like it's literally just a desert.
Like the place where you would want solar, yeah?
Yeah, it's like the place, it's literally like as you go from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, you are driving through San Bernardino County, and most of that is like just desert. With it's desert, so lots of sun, and it's also a high desert, so there's plenty of wind. And they were like, nope, can't do it, not allowed. And they did it by exploiting part of these bureaucratic processes. Second, the Second Avenue subway in New York City. 12 years between New Yorkers passing a bond issue for just the first 3 stations of the Second Avenue subway to open in 2017. And in the near decade since then, there's been essentially no movement further. And on top of that, this Second Avenue subway cost 8 to 12 times more than the global average for this kind of project. Similarly, in New York, congestion pricing also took forever to get implemented. There were quite literally thousands of pages of research that the MTA had to put together on what the impacts of this program were going to be. And then it very nearly wasn't implemented. And now it might be going away again, potentially, because of, again, more bureaucratic procedure. Meanwhile, in contrast to New York's Second Avenue subway, Paris, in France, a country not exactly well known for its blistering efficiency, has moved with comparably breathtaking speed, transforming the city into one of the best in the world for cycling in just a few years, removing tens of thousands of parking spaces to fight congestion and air pollution, which has seen air pollution decrease by 40% in the last decade in the French capital. And they are currently building a 120-mile subway expansion called the Grand Paris Express with 68 new stations that is expected to serve 2 million passengers every single day. Megan, do you want to know how much this project cost relative to the Second Avenue subway per mile?
I do. I really do. Because again, this is not, Paris is not the example you usually pick when you say, oh my gosh, this is such an efficient use of government funding.
Yeah, Paris, well known for being a libertarian paradise with no labor protections and deeply, deeply efficient. So at a per mile cost, the Grand Paris Express costs roughly $380 million per mile. That is 6.5 times less expensive than the Second Avenue subway. And okay, you might have remembered earlier I said that the Second Avenue subway cost 8 to 12 times more than the global average. The Grand Paris Express, that cost for it, is also a cost overrun. Even at Paris, blowing through their projected costs to such an extent that like the cost of this Grand Paris Express has caused a minor scandal in France. Even with that, they are still coming in at 6.5 times below the cost of the Second Avenue subway. And a big part of this is that we
fairness to people who don't like spending money on things. It certainly seems like we're not doing it very well.
I mean, here's the thing, like, we're not spending money. We're spending a lot of money. The Second Avenue subway is the most expensive per mile line in the entire world. We're spending lots of money. We're spending billions of dollars. We're just not getting hardly anything for it.
Yeah.
To bring it to a third example here, I'm going to keep hitting you with these examples because they're all over the place. Affordable housing construction in California is not exempt from local zoning regulations. It's not exempt from parking regulations. It's not exempt from basically anything, or at least it wasn't. There's many bills in the legislature last session and this session that are trying to fix this. Thanks to this complex web of state and local regulations that affordable housing needs to move through, it costs as much as $1 million per unit of affordable housing just to construct it in the state of California, with an average cost of roughly $680,000 per unit. This is just completely unsustainable. It will not work.
It really disincentivizes building affordable housing, does it not?
It does. It does. Not only can the state of California not fund this, for-profit developers, non-profit developers that might want to build affordable housing or add affordable housing to their developments in order to get certain density bonuses, certain things that are in other parts of process in state government, they cannot do it because it just costs far too much money. But another example here along housing in California, infill housing, by which we mean housing in already built up areas. So think housing built on the parking lot, across the street from a big office tower. That is not exempt from environmental review in California, despite literally all of the available evidence suggesting that infill development is actually net positive for the environment and for the climate, because you're not sprawling out into, previously untouched wilderness.
Also, if you're building an apartment building on a parking lot, it's not like you're trying to save some owl habitat or something.
No, it's not.
That.
It's absolutely not. But it is not exempt from environmental review, which means that if you want to build a large apartment building in, say, San Francisco or Los Angeles or San Diego, you basically have to produce a 400-page environmental impact statement that basically always in the end says, yep, no negative impacts here, boss, you're good to go.
Okay.
Because we're not exempt from process, because we are addicted to this process.
I want to jump in on this one, CEQA specifically, but also some of the consultative processes that we've come up with. They were a great idea when they started.
Yes. We will go over this in the back half in great detail.
This a little bit?
Yes.
Okay.
But so...
Great. I'm glad we're flagging that now so people don't get mad at us.
Yes. So the long story short of this is that there's a lot of laws in California and all over the country, really, that necessitate a lengthy community input process for lots of types of development, lots of public infrastructure projects. And one of these in California is CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. And one of the things that CEQA does is it provides a private cause of action. So you, as a private citizen, can bring a CEQA suit. Maybe, Megan, as the resident attorney on the podcast, do you want to explain maybe a little more in detail what a private cause of action actually is?
You nailed it. It is generally accepted that there are some reasons in common law, just like law that we inherited from England. There's a bunch of reasons you can sue somebody, the standard, personal injury, tort, contract, whatever. But under a lot of circumstances, you need the law to give you that affirmative right to start a civil suit against an individual. And generally speaking, you also need to show that you personally or a group that you are a member of is being harmed in some way. So CEQA creates that nexus for harm. I believe, I'm not a CEQA expert at all, but CEQA gives you the opportunity as a person who lives in the neighborhood, for example, to say, this is the only open air space where we can get sunlight coming into our buildings. So we don't want you to put up another building on what is currently a parking lot, et cetera, because that will negatively impact the current residents.
Yeah, basically. So CEQA offers this private cause of action where you don't have to wait for the state or some authority to come in and say you're in violation of this environmental law. You can file a civil suit, which in many cases will halt the development for the time being. And while that claim is adjudicated, the development cannot move forward. And the thing is that's not like valence neutral, right? While you are waiting to continue like developing the project, whatever it is, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's normal housing, whether it's commercial or what have you, right? While you're waiting for that, you have to be dealing with financing from like banks and financial institutions.
There's carrying costs involved.
You have to figure out, are you still paying like laborers, or are they just sort of, like in limbo for a while? You still have to be paying property taxes on the land, at least the value of the land, right? And the thing is that these CEQA suits are just absolutely rampant when it comes to housing development in California. A report from a couple of years ago found that 25% of all CEQA suits in the state are about infill housing development. Basically, every single, even moderately large apartment proposal, we're talking like a 30-unit building when I say moderately large, right? Something that's like you would see in your normal sort of multifamily area, right? My building is pretty small. There's 12 units in here, right? A slightly larger building almost always gets hit with a CEQA suit. And this slows down the pace of housing production in California to the extent that it has probably the worst housing crisis of just about any subnational jurisdiction on Earth. Maybe outside of like, London in the UK, which has just an absolutely terrible, terrible, terrible housing crisis right now. And also I should note there's a lot of these processes in London as well. So it's not just a US specific thing. I guess to continue maybe a little bit along this line of community input processes, we'll talk about them a little more later, but the community engagement process isn't just for buildings. It's not just for like apartments. It's also for infrastructure, right? To give you a couple of additional examples from Los Angeles, just where I'm most familiar with. Los Angeles has actually built far and away the most rail transit of any city in the United States over the last 35 years, since LA Metro opened its first metro lines back in the 1990s. But even despite that, LA Metro routinely faces just insane delays, pushing back, for example, the expected Sepulveda line, which is expected to connect the San Fernando Valley with the west side, so one of like the primary residential areas of the city, north of the Santa Monica Mountains, to the west side business districts, where you have Century City, Westwood, UCLA, Culver City, Fox Studios, Sony Studios, right? Like lots and lots of job opportunities that right now all of these people who work there and live in the valley are taking the 405 down through the Sepulveda Pass. There's a proposed subway line that has been pushed back 5 or 6 times, basically because wealthy homeowners in Bel Air continue to throw up legal obstacles using every procedural trick in the book that they can to stop this from being built, not with a stop at Bel Air or anything like that, but just underground, underneath Bel Air's homes.
So, just a quick side note, do you remember the movie Volcano? Came out in like 1996.
I don't think I've ever seen this movie, unfortunately.
Okay, it was in the, natural disaster genre of the 90s. I think it came out shortly after Twister. Anyway, it takes place in LA. And there is a whole plot point about people objecting to subway expansion through Bel Air.
It's been 30 years!
I know.
I can't keep getting away with this.
Yep.
Maybe.
Anyway, so there you go.
You could at least maybe understand why people would be like super involved in that. Like you can understand why Bel Air homeowners would be throwing up all of these hurdles, right?
You can understand, but they're bad.
They're bad, but you can understand. Another example here in Los Angeles that I think is like really indicative of just how insane this is there's a proposal that has been in existence for a really long time to put bus rapid transit lanes along Venice Boulevard, which is like one of the biggest major thoroughfares in the city.
They did this, right? They finally did it.
Yes, but only for parts of Venice Boulevard. And it took them 3 years of community engagement to put in these painted bus lanes. Like, there is absolutely no reason why your community engagement process should take 3 years. Like there's no reason at all. Like it it like boggles the mind how you can be like that completely addicted to process that you're like, well, let's go back out for our 9th round of community engagement. Like, it's just not necessary for this kind of project, for any kind of.
I really, if you're not going to just have a vote, I don't know why you would. You know exactly what people are going to say. People who commute on Venice Boulevard are going to complain about congestion. People who take the bus, if they are able to show up at these community engagement processes at all, will say, I would really like to have like a more efficient bus transit option. Thank you.
Yes, you know what people are going to say. Yeah. Anyway, or you do it like once. You make it as open and available as possible. Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll talk about this in the back half. Okay. 3 more examples I want to go in before we take a break. A couple of international comparisons. To stay in California for a bit, everyone knows like sort of your favorite boondoggle, California high-speed rail, being built first in the Central Valley rather than directly from San Francisco to Los Angeles. Doesn't make a ton of sense. Not using the existing I-5 as the right of way, right? Like runs through the state already, like can use it. Don't have to like get any sort of jurisdictional approval. Instead of doing that, because of like political reasons, they've routed it through some Central Valley cities. They needed these routes in order to get the votes to fund it in the first place back when it was originally proposed. The result is that every single jurisdiction in the path of this thing is using some provision in law to try to like extract their pound of flesh out of the project, either to stop it from happening, stop it passing through their community because they don't want it, like the Bel Air homeowners are doing for the subway. Basically, every single jurisdiction that this thing is passing through is trying to stop it in some way. And the result is that we've spent $128 billion in the project. It's taken 20 years so far and is set to miss yet more deadlines and is still not open, right? Completely insane. To give you another sense of how insane this is, SNCF, which is the French national railway operator, it's a nationalized business. These don't really exist in the United States anymore, but they exist elsewhere. It's a company owned by the French government. Was originally attached to help build this project because France has like one of the world's best high-speed rail networks. Very, very familiar with how to build this technology. They pulled out of the project in 2011 in favor of Morocco, which they said was less politically dysfunctional than the state of California. Like a fully quasi-authoritarian state. They're like, this
brains running on time.
Like, this is less politically dysfunctional than the state of California. And to put it even further context, the high-speed rail line between Casablanca and Tangier opened in 2018 and carried an estimated 3 million passengers in 2023.
And high-speed rail still doesn't exist in California, so it seems like they made the right choice.
Still doesn't exist in California. SNCF absolutely got it right? This is the level of process and political dysfunction that we're talking about here. To give you a couple other international train comparisons, Tren Maya, which there's a lot of controversy attached to about like whether it's good for indigenous communities and all that, but it did get built. Right? Runs at higher speed, not full high speed, but like 160 kilometers per hour, which is higher speed rail, if not high speed rail. And it opened its first operating segment just 3 years after starting construction. And here we are 20 years into the process in California and nothing's gotten done. Similarly, during this same time period, Spain, again, not a country known for incredible efficiency, with a unemployment rate that's like 2 to 3 times higher than the United States, has gotten so good at building high-speed rail that it now has the second longest high-speed rail network in the entire world, only after China, a country that is like 30 times its size. The point is that I'm trying to make here is that things cost more than they should, and they are goddamn impossible to build. At the same time that many of our international peers who are genuinely much less wealthy and much less economic growth, like Spain has had unemployment rates that are 2 to 3 times higher than the United States for the last 30 fucking years. Like, for crying out loud. Like, we are getting lapped by our international peers who are not known as like paragons of efficiency. Like, they're just fucking lapping us when it comes to infrastructure development. And it is because, in large part, we are just completely addicted to these processes. Like, I know that I've been monologuing at you guys for like literally 25 minutes now. Like, I'm sorry I haven't let Megan get in a word in edgewise, but I am just I am just like, this is so incredibly baffling to me that we have like let ourselves fall into this trap. Like, we are just completely addicted to doing things so by the book that we can't recognize when the book is fucking stupid.
We put a man on the moon and can't build a train system.
Literally, we put a man on the fucking moon. Like, you know the joke that's like about like the founding fathers, right? Like, what would the founding fathers say if they could see the country today? And the punchline of the joke is the moon? You put a guy on the moon in the sky. You put a guy up there, right? Like, we put a fucking dude on the moon. We put several dudes on the moon. We put robots on other planets. And we can't build a fucking train in the state of California.
Okay, so we're gonna need some time for Clayton to calm down. Should we take a break?
No, I want to fill out one thing before we take our break. Okay. Because I've given you a bunch of examples here. I've gotten extremely animated about it because I find this completely bewildering. What I want to say here before we go into the solutions is that these are not isolated examples, right? I haven't just provided you with a bunch of different examples for the fun of it. Like, we know that this is happening at a systematic level. One of the best books.
And we know what the systematic problems are.
Yes, we know that this is happening at a systematic level. We know what the systematic problems are. And like, we have really good recent research that suggests there are like clear relationships that we can identify here. One of the best books on this subject at the local level is Sarah Anzia's Local Interests. She's a political scientist at UC Berkeley. She wrote a book called Local Interests. And one of the key findings in this book, specifically related to housing, but also related to infrastructure and sort of all this other stuff, is that where homeowners associations are more active, you see less stuff happening. And the primary reason for this is because they have the ability to gum up the process. Like, what we are doing here is systematically, artificially limiting ourselves. We are creating scarcity where it does not need to exist. We have become so obsessed with putting in processes and analyses and studies and safeguards to make sure that nothing bad happens that we've ended up making sure that nothing happens at all, including making sure that nothing good happens, right? We can't build bus lanes. We can't build trains. We can't implement universal healthcare. We can't build California high-speed rail. We can't build affordable housing. We can't build any housing because of all of these processes and safeguards that we've put in place. And while, as Megan said, many of these ideas were done with good intentions, shall we say, at the beginning, they have since been co-opted by interests who simply do not want anything to happen, and it is impoverishing the entire nation because of it. With that in mind, then, we will take a brief break here for me to find all of my marbles, and then we'll come back and we will tell you what exactly we should do about it to stop this from continuing into the future. All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. We've taken a little break. I went and I grabbed a lemonade. I've calmed down a little bit. And here we are to tell you guys about, now that we've gone through all of this stuff, after I've ranted at you for half an hour basically, what do we do to solve this problem? What are the things that we can do to sort of balance the need for some sort of community input with actually like getting things done in the end? Because right now we're not doing anything, and we really need to be doing things.
Yeah. For the sake of argument, we need to assume that we have the capacity to do things.
Yes.
If you want to hear more about that, again, go back to the last episode and listen to our state capacity episode.
Yeah. Caveat that none of these things that we can do are going to be about state capacity. We covered that. Go listen to that. We'll take it from there with that assumption in mind. So with that in mind, let's move on. So what can we actually do here? So the first one of these, real big, real sexy. Sure, you guys have heard about it all over the news. Permitting reform.
Oh yeah.
Woo! Permitting reform. Okay. So the TLDR here on permitting reform is that a lot of the laws that we passed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, after we did a lot of bad shit, right? A lot of the laws that we passed to make it harder to build things like oil wells and big polluting factories and landfills and stuff, and like trash incineration plants. A lot of the laws that we used to make it harder to build those near communities or to build those at all are being used to block things like new housing, solar projects, transit projects, wind projects, so on and so forth. Quite simply, we have to reform these laws so that they can stop the things that they were intended to stop, but not to be co-opted to stop things that actually need to get done, like transit projects, like green energy projects, so on and so forth. This is tricky, I think, because people have different ideas of like what good and bad things are, right?
Absolutely. And it's very generational. I will jump in to say, especially ideas of environmentalism. I think people our parents' age may have an idea of environmentalism as being open green space in otherwise urban communities. And we have discussed how there's a place for that and a time for that, but if it interferes with density is what actually prohibits vehicle emissions and the global warming, basically, global climate change.
Yeah,
implications that emissions have, or particulate, tire debris, etc. If you have fewer people needing to travel long distances, that's better for the environment across the board. That's kind of a new understanding of environmentalism.
Yeah. There's a persistent holdover from the environmentalism of the 60s and 70s that anything that looks like consumption must be bad. And building density, building mixed-use spaces, building transit, that's all consumption, right? That's all using resources and therefore must be bad. There's like a lot of like local Sierra Club chapters in California, for example, that will like routinely oppose the development of like solar projects, for example. And it's like, what on earth are we doing here, people? Like, how can you be the Sierra Club and like oppose building a solar project? Like, come on.
That in exactly that way.
Yeah,
that's their thought process.
That is their thought process. Yeah. So it's up to policymakers, right, to actually like look at the evidence, but like what is actually necessary here, like what is actually beneficial to communities, and then write these laws in such a way that it excludes the things that like we actually don't want. Like you have to go through these processes to build the things that are genuinely harmful. But when it comes to things that are not harmful and in fact are beneficial, given what we know from the scientific research, we need to exempt those things from the just completely onerous processes that currently exist. So it's tricky, but I think that we can do it if we can persuade policymakers, of what's right here. In our view, right in the normative sense, not the positive sense. All right, so that's one thing. A second thing that we have to do, and this sort of goes along with permitting reform, but is not directly related, is that we have to make these requirements, we have to make these processes clearer and cleaner. Like, we have to make it so that they don't have all of the sort of regulatory hurdles and discretionary processes that end up gumming things up. Like, they have to be sufficiently, when we were doing the research for this episode, Megan described them as nimble, right? Like, you have to have, maybe do you want to take this one, Megan?
So as somebody who has written laws and policies, it's important to include things that make it obvious for decision makers which way they should go. And I think that change will increase the speed. And that is something that we're talking about. We want these questions of whether or not a particular project should be allowed in a particular place or in a particular community to sit on as few desks as possible for as little time as possible. And the easiest way to create that speed is to kind of create a flowchart or an outline for the person who has to make that decision and say, it's a solar farm. The only reasons I should reject this are A, B, and C.
Yeah, exactly.
And nothing else. That goes so much more quickly than saying, well, if it's in the interest of the community, for example, you will approve it. Who is the community? What is their interest, etc. So that's more what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a kind of a quicker or a more nimble policymaking process.
Yeah, we want to get away from these discretionary processes, which we know delay the development of various projects. There's an interesting study in the Journal of the American Planning Association, I think, from a couple of years ago by Manville, Monken, Gray, and Phillips, which looks at discretion in housing approvals and just like general building approvals, and finds that the presence of like a discretionary process, one where, like you said, Megan, if it's in the interest of the community, right, then you can approve it, that increases project times by an average of 28% on average. And it also increases the variability of the time frame in which those projects are approved. So getting rid of these discretionary processes and replacing them with ministerial processes, which is the sort of like, here are the reasons that you can reject this thing. They are A, B, and C. Replacing those kinds of processes with processes that work better. If you satisfy the requirements, you are legally entitled to build the project. That's the next part of this sort of like permitting reform. We need to get away from this wishy-washy way of permitting things and just look at sort of very specific use cases. Additionally, on this point, I want to make it clear that this is like not happening, right? Like right now, well, not that this is not happening in that we're not going to achieve this, but like this is not happening currently. This is just
not the way we currently operate.
This is not the way we currently do things. Yeah. Again, I hate to go back to Los Angeles for our non-Los Angeles listeners, but this is just what I'm familiar with. Every single housing development with 50 or more homes has to go under a process called site plan review, which triggers a mandatory discretionary approval process. However, even though it's supposed to be for only 50 or more unit buildings, nearly every kind of multifamily project triggers some form of discretionary review in the city of Los Angeles. This is a quote from the paper I mentioned earlier. From 2014 to 2016 in Los Angeles, among projects of 5 homes or more, only 6% of homes were approved by right. The remainder were approved largely by project-specific discretionary changes. This is not sustainable. Completely unsustainable. And importantly, as we've talked about earlier in the episode, affordable housing projects also need to go through this process. And people being NIMBYs in this case, absolutely do not want affordable housing projects to be built near them. And so giving them an effective community veto over this process just means that affordable housing doesn't end up getting built. Housing prices get worse and homelessness increases. That is just like the very clear, explicit chain of events. It's what we have. It's what we have right now, and we need to get away from it. Another piece of this kind of approval process that we can point to is like there's international best practices that we are not using here in the United States. And one of these is called self-certification. People don't love the idea of self-certification here in the United States.
Yes, I will admit to that as well. I wrote a building code that had self-certification when I was counsel in Palau.
People don't know. People really don't like the idea. They don't like the idea. But it is basically international best practice. Like the idea behind self-certification is that people who are like licensed architects and engineers can self-certify that their project meets the applicable standards for building code, zoning code, so on and so forth. And then sort of random checks, right, by an authority are what is intended to keep these like architects and engineers in line, basically, right? Like if you have an inspection and the inspection finds that like you were lying about having certified this properly, right? Then you lose your ability to do that, and there's sort of other legal penalties. This dramatically speeds up development in lots of other countries. I'm less inclined to believe we can actually get this one done here in the United States. There is a pilot program for it in Los Angeles, or I suppose I should say there's a proposed pilot program for it in Los Angeles, but I'm maybe a little skeptical that it's going to go anywhere. It's just one of those things that's like people really don't want like builders to be able to certify things on their own with not terrible reason, right? That we're worried about this, but it's sort of another one of those things where it's like we're so focused on making sure that nothing bad happens that we're instead making sure that nothing happens at all.
Speaking of which,
sorry, go ahead. Yeah, speaking of which,
let's talk about the community input process.
Yeah, I think this will probably be sort of the meat of the second half here. So we want to be clear that the purpose behind the community engagement process is an important one, right?
Absolutely.
We put a lot of these processes in place in the 1970s and 80s in order to basically avoid what happened with the interstate highway system happening again.
Yes.
For those who don't know, the interstate highway system basically routed all of its like in-city routings directly through poor Black, Latino, Asian neighborhoods. Whatever sort of the minority community in a given city was, that's where the freeway ended up being routed. Here in Los Angeles, the 10 freeway runs right through what used to be the Sugar Hill neighborhood, which was a very, well, not very, I suppose I should say, like comparatively wealthy Black neighborhood, right? And is now, split basically by this freeway. It totally destroyed the wealth that was in this community. And this happened all over the country, right? Like pervasively.
Absolutely.
And so
it's become this joke, oh, Mayor Pete says that freeways are racist. And it's like, no, factually, this is actually, yes. It sounds absurd, but it is a thing that is true, that the interstate highway system was built through Black and brown communities. Almost
only, right? Like almost without fail, it was built through these communities where they existed, because they didn't have the political power.
The least wealthy or the most othered community in any given city is the city that was faced with the greatest negative impact of the interstate highway system, particularly.
Yeah, and so
across the board.
We want to be clear that these processes do have an important purpose, right? They were put in place to make sure that that kind of thing didn't happen again. However, right now,
that's not what they do.
They are not being used in that way, right? And so we need to develop these processes, reform these processes in a way where they actually engage those communities. Because right now, they just fully aren't. There are a number of recent studies that look at this. There's a book called Neighborhood Defenders by Katie Einstein, David Glick, and Max Palmer at Boston University. There is a paper by Alexander Son in the American Journal of Political Science. You can tell that this is like maybe part of my ongoing dissertation research by the fact that I can just rattle these off the top of my head. But basically what they find is that people who show up to this meeting are whiter, wealthier, much older, and much more likely to be homeowners than the communities that they come from. The Alexander Son paper that I mentioned just briefly has found that the median person who shows up to these meetings is 27 years older than the median community member. For context, I am 27.
It is a whole Clayton older.
They are a whole Clayton older than the average person in their communities. And importantly, very importantly, the people who show up to these meetings also seem to be, just based on the makeup of their comments versus public opinion polls, substantially more likely to oppose housing and infrastructure projects than the communities are as a whole.
Well, and if we can dig into this for a second, I know there are a number of reasons why those people fitting those characteristics are more likely to show up to those meetings. But we have created in our country a financial system that really incentivizes protecting the value of the home that you own or that you are paying the bank for in installments. It doesn't strike me as surprising that someone who has been pouring money into their house for years or decades is going to oppose something that has been shown to lower the value of their home, like putting a freeway in 10 blocks away or putting a light rail stop nearby because people associate transit with crime, or putting affordable housing nearby, or putting a community shelter or some other sort of social service nearby because people associate those with crime, largely because they just associate poor and homeless people with crime. And they're trying to protect their investment. It makes sense even if some of the underlying assumptions that they're making in that process aren't good.
Yes. And I should point out, like in the Neighborhood Defenders book, they look at like what are the themes that commenters talk about. Commenters are really, really worried about traffic. They are really worried about traffic when they talk about like housing being built. Like something like 65% of commenters in their sample in the Boston area mentioned traffic in some way.
Do they think that's sincere, or do they think that is a pretext?
They don't really take an explicit position in the book. I will say that I have been to a number of these meetings, and people do seem sincere when they're talking about traffic being a concern for them. I went to a city council meeting in Beverly Hills last summer where they were talking about building this like large apartment development, mixed use development that would include like a hotel and some shops and lots of apartments. A certain percentage of those would have been affordable. People, like, I would say maybe 5 or 6 of the people who spoke in opposition to the development explicitly mentioned, like, oh my God, like, we won't even be able to get out of our driveways. Like, and they seem to be pretty sincere in that fear, which is insane because then they also oppose the transit that would make it less problematic for housing to get built in the first place. But so it's this web of like self-defeating things, right, that people believe. Like, we can't build transit because there's no demand for it here, but also if you build the things that would make there be demand for transit, like, that's going to ruin my life and mean that I can't leave my driveway and I'll be stuck in my house. Some of them were maybe laying it on a little bit thick. The long story short of this, though, is that one of the reasons, in addition to sort of all of the economic reasons, the protecting investment sort of rationales, the reason that these people are able to show up and the people who like might benefit from this don't show up, one of the key reasons here is that these sessions are always at like 2 p.m. on like a random fucking Thursday. And like, you know who like can't go to a meeting at 2 p.m. on a Thursday? People who like work for a living.
People with jobs?
People who work for a living. People who like take the transit through the places where the like transit is being proposed.
For whatever it's worth, there is no way to pull into this meeting, or it would be, I think, probably very difficult to pull into this meeting, someone who says, yeah, I'd love to live in an affordable apartment in Beverly Hills. That sounds amazing. But I don't live in Beverly Hills yet, something.
Yeah, the people who would benefit from the project are not invited to come to the meeting where they talk about it because they don't live there yet. They're not part of the community yet. They're not yet the constituents of the people who are making the decision in the city council, right? Or on the planning commission or whatever, right? They're not the neighbors of these people yet, even though they would be. They could be if these projects were developed. So this process has problems. It was intended for good purposes. How do we actually fix this issue? I think the first one is that we need to shorten the timeline for community engagement, but make sure that people who show up are actually representative of the community. We can check back on how exactly we make sure of that second part after I finish my dissertation, which is partly what this is about. But one of the key things is holding larger public meetings with more publicity at better times for people. Like, one of the reasons why a bunch of like rich white retirees who are 27 years older than their community show up to these meetings is because they are no longer working, right? Or if they are working, they're working in jobs where they can afford to take a day off of work and come to these meetings. Instead, these meetings should be during the evenings. They should be on the weekends. They should be in more venues, right? Where people can get to. You need to do like larger.
Why do we need to do these in person at all?
Well, there's another paper from that same team that wrote the Neighborhood Defenders book that suggests that doing these over Zoom doesn't actually increase participation.
I guess my comparison would be if you submit comment during the notice and comment period for the Code of Federal Regulations, you're doing that in writing, basically on a web forum, and you're not going to a meeting and taking time out of your schedule. Is there data on that we could refer to in terms of effectiveness?
We do have like e-comment processes in a lot of cities now.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I am aware, there are no studies that look at whether city staff and city council members weight written comments differently than they weight comments made in person, but there is evidence that suggests that what people say in the meetings in person, at least, do tend to predict whether the body that's making the decision will make an affirmative decision or a negative decision. So like what's to maybe, be a little bit of the oldest Gen Z, youngest millennial here, what happens in the room where it happens seems to be important. It seems to be important. So figuring out how to solve that problem of like unequal representation in these meetings and in these processes that I think will go the longest way to solving this problem in the first place. Like, if you get people who are representative of the community opinion at large in this process, then I think you will see different decisions being made. Again, check back in on this after I finished my dissertation in 2 years. And then, fourth and finally on this point, like, we need to stop letting the community engagement process as it currently exists, especially if we can't fix that other problem, from being this effective veto that a wealthy minority is wielding over city politics. Like, city leaders need to do things and not go out for their 9th round of community engagement. Like, it's better to do one big, expensive round of community engagement, figure out what people want and what they're willing to accept, rather than 2 years, 3 years of stringing the project along and failing to engage the people that they claim to want to bring into the process in the first place. Like, at a certain point, if you're not engaging the people that you should be engaging, you can't go back out again and again and again doing the same thing and expecting different results. At a certain point, you just have to make the decision that the evidence suggests you should make and stop letting this like wealthy minority be this veto player in the system.
I do also want to jump in and point out that letting the process take too long does actually create harm, and not just for the developers. In situations where, again, to come back to the interstate highway system, et cetera, in situations where you are aware that you are going to be putting a major public development or something in a particular community and you are going to be seizing some property by eminent domain, there are times when that knowledge pushes property values down preemptively. That happened in a Portland community called Lentz, which is bisected by 205 outside of Portland. And that really created a lot of blight in that community. And crime, etc. That neighborhood still has a really terrible reputation for exactly that issue, but that, kind of sense of impending doom pushes down people in that community.
By the time that it actually arrives there, like, the project is actually doing the eminent domain, the like fair market value, right, is less. Yeah.
It's less.
And so those
homeowners got doubly screwed.
Yeah.
By the state and by the federal authorities that were paying for it, because they not only had their homes taken, they kind of had to wait around for it to get eminent domained, because who's going to buy a house
that they know is about to be absolutely, yeah, 100%, yes. 100%, yeah.
So anyway, that sucks.
You can also think of this in a way of like, if it's a housing development or affordable housing in particular, or I think the best example of this is permanent supportive housing, which is housing built specifically to house people who were formerly or currently homeless, right? If that takes 3 years to build, 4 years to build, then the people who are currently living on the street with nowhere to go are directly harmed by the fact that they're spending 2, 3, 4 more years in the street.
That's a fabulous point. Been, yes.
Right? Like, it's directly harmful to the people that these projects are intended to help.
Additionally, not for nothing, something that people tend to complain about is the presence of people living on the street.
Yeah.
It's not...
It's like,
and nobody, again, this is a very not in my backyard kind of thing. It's like, well, I would very much like for people to not be living on the street, but I don't want them to be living in a supportive housing community that's 2 blocks over from me. We got to put it somewhere. What should we just draw straws?
Yeah. Like,
that might be the fairest outcome, honestly. Just put a bunch of census tracts in a jar and shake it.
I mean, there's a decent amount of evidence that, like, the higher the geographic level you make these decisions, like about zoning, about like master plans or whatever, the higher the geographic level, the more likely they are to pass.
That makes perfect sense, because, if you've got a small district as a city council member, then each individual person within your district matters much more to your re-election chances than to the governor of the state.
There's an interesting paper where, like, the data isn't great just because there's few cities that have like changed in this way, but a paper that suggests that electing city council members by district as opposed to at large decreases housing production in the city, because the city council members are worried that, like, if they vote specifically for a project that's going to get built in their district, and they worry that voters are going to like be angry with them for it, they're less likely to support that project. Whereas if you have an at-large city council where everyone's elected on like a list system, where like the top, 3 or top 2 vote getters in any given election cycle are the ones who get seated on the council, they're much more insulated from that problem. So it's just another example of that like level of geographic abstraction. Speaking of the level of geographic abstraction, though, onto our last potential solution. We need to pass laws at the state level that preempt this kind of like local chicanery, basically. Cities that do not want infrastructure projects to happen or housing to get built are going to find ways, both legal and not so legal, to try to stop them unless they do not have the avenues to try to stop them. If they do not have the ability to point to these discretionary processes to do insane things that try to make it harder for these things to happen. For example, the city of Huntington Beach, which people might have heard about in the last week or so for putting a MAGA plaque at one of the city's libraries. Not incredible stuff from the city council right there. They've lost several lawsuits over failure to follow state housing law and has been trying to stifle development in the city. Beverly Hills at one point got its permitting authority taken away from it because it had tried to claim a bunch of places that would get turned into housing that were like obviously not going to get turned into housing. This is a particularity of California law that I guess I should explain, called the housing element process, where every decade basically cities in California are required to demonstrate that they are planning for a certain amount of additional housing, and there has to be like an actual achievable pathway to that happening. And Beverly Hills was saying like, oh, this hospital and this car dealership that was just renovated, these places will get turned into housing, right? Like in its plan, for example, the city said that an Audi dealership on Wilshire Boulevard that was just renovated was going to get turned into 41 apartments. And the judge was like, this doesn't pass the smell test.
I don't think so. Is this like a pre-clearance component? When you say permitting authority, it's like pre-clearance.
Honestly,
for
yeah, like they have, yeah. So permitting authority, I mean, like they are not allowed to issue, at least during the, I couldn't find what actually was the result of this case because it was like a temporary stay. They got their ability to like issue permits for like renovations taken away. Like they couldn't issue any building permits unless it was to expand the housing supply. Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, right? Like, great, which I think would be great. Although at the same, like, basically, like, you can't redo your kitchen because Beverly Hills won't build more housing, which might be a way to bring people into,
You're pressuring the city. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I can't redo my kitchen because you guys can't get your shit together. Yeah, absolutely. But if I was a rich person in Beverly Hills, that would motivate the hell out of me.
Yeah. Perhaps the most egregious example of this kind of like insane behavior from cities, though, is the Bay Area suburb of Woodside, California, which in 2022 tried to declare itself a mountain lion habitat to avoid complying with state housing law. Basically, the law that they passed in the state legislature said that you could, you couldn't build housing on like protected wildlife lands or whatever. So the city of Woodside,
some follow-up questions.
And so the city of Woodside was like, "We are a mountain lion sanctuary. We are a mountain lion sanctuary." That is like literally what they did.
Sure.
Eventually, though, under pressure from the
were there mountain lions?
There are mountain lions. California? There are mountain lions in that area. But
what do they do when there's a mountain lion? Because if it's anything other than just let them do their thing.
Yeah, you're not exactly a mountain. Yeah, exactly. So
that's so great.
They eventually had to reverse course and
no, you don't say.
Under pretty intense pressure from the attorney general and many conservation groups that were like, look, you guys are making us look bad. But the fact is that they shouldn't have been able to avail themselves of that like provision of law in the first place, right? Like there has to be some sort of law passed at the state level that preempts this kind of trickery, basically. Because cities are going to try every trick in the book if they don't want housing and infrastructure projects to get built to try to stop them. And so we need to be like, this project is exempt from everything, right? Like more or less, right? Like at a certain point, certain point, if you're like,
we're protecting local elected officials from their own incentives. It's the people, it's the retirees who have money and are homeowners who are not only coming to these meetings and opposing new housing, but also the people who are working for, supporting city council members, the most likely voters in local elections. Voters in local elections tend to be older, whiter, and more likely to be homeowners. These elected officials need to be protected from themselves, basically, if the goal across the board is to build stuff, get stuff done, make big changes.
Do things.
Yeah.
To embrace results, right? So, to give an example of what this might look like, for example, a state could pass a law that says affordable housing development in this state is exempt from local rules and is only subject to certain state standards. Or that cities, basically so that cities can't do things like all of the three examples we just gave you. Will this happen? Maybe, honestly. There's been a lot of state preemption laws that have been floated in various states across the country, mostly with regards to housing, because housing is just the thing that is motivating a lot of city politics right now. And if we do that, I think you'll see a lot more movement. If these things are only subject to the kinds of clear ministerial standards that we talked about earlier in the second half of this episode, the ministerial approval is done according to those state standards, then I think we have we'll have gone a fair way, right, to actually getting rid of some of these really dire discretionary processes.
It's important to remember that the point of government is to do things. We are not just creating a system that is process as the point. The point is to create things, build things, create positive change for people. And we're not doing that when we are bogged down by the processes we've constructed.
Yeah, the point of the process is to make sure that things happen in the right way, right? Quote unquote, the right way. But it is still to make sure that the things happen, right? And right now they're failing at that point. They're so bogged down in doing process for process's sake that it's just not working out. It's just not achieving the ends.
To come back to that point about nimbleness, we're so afraid of doing something wrong, doing something incorrect, or getting to a bad outcome that we bog ourselves down in a process when really trying something, realizing that it isn't going to work, and fixing it may be the better outcome. Put in the bus lanes, paint bus only. And if it doesn't work, we paint over the bus only signage on the road. There's a way to fix it.
Yeah, there isn't a point of no return a lot of the time with many of these projects, right? If things aren't working, if you try a process that doesn't end up working, it's better to go and fix that process than it is to just continue relying on one that will not work, does not work consistently like we are doing right now.
Absolutely.
But until that time, until we manage to get rid of these discretionary processes, pass laws that make it so that states cannot try to shirk their obligations, reform the community input process, before we do all of these things, until then, I have been Clayton Becker.
And I have been Megan Cox.
And we will see you guys on the next one.